Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. It's Friday, July 24th, 2026, episode 555. And we're going to talk about one of potentially Trump's legacies. So I was listening this morning to my normal morning podcast. I was listening to Monaco 64, and he was talking to Peter Carlin. And he said something which, you know, uh, I think I should repeat as well that the terminology is becoming used more frequently, and that is sweet and sour crude, something that, I heard about a long time ago, but it's coming back into the everyday conversation. The difference between the crude oil that is produced here in the United States versus the crude that's produced over in the Middle East. And a lot of people believe that crude oil is crude oil, but this is not true. And the difference is primarily in the sulfur content, the amount of sulfur that is in the different kinds of crude oil. And as a result, different kinds of crude are used for different things. So I believe the crude oil that's mainly produced here in the United States is for gasoline, whereas the sour crude is for diesel, jet fuel, things like that. And we're running out. And so diesel is used for all of the trucks here in the United States. And so the trucks deliver all of the products that we order, that we buy at the grocery or any kind of department store, or even what is delivered to our front door. And so if that runs out, then we're going to see some really bad things happening here in the United States. At the very least, prices should go through the roof. And although that might make us panic, we should remember that the cure for higher prices is higher prices. So we have to realize this is part of the process. You can't avoid it, and we have to get through it. Okay, so that's a little bit of the current event thing. But I heard a lot of people say that the people that I listen to, right, the guests that Judge Napolitano has, and who also pop up in other podcasts. But anyway, they all say that Trump is concerned about his legacy. And so one way he is trying to take care of them is by profiting off of the United States through his Truth Social tweets. Um, so he knows that they influence the market, and so he tries to sell that influence to family and friends. But whenever something goes wrong, whenever something happens which doesn't look like it's going to have a good outcome, then he panics. For example, when that rescue operation in the middle of the desert in Iran that happened not too long ago, he started freaking out that maybe he was going to be like Jimmy Carter when he had an embarrassing desert operation trying to rescue the hostages out of Iran. And so now, oh, we're on the brink of a military disaster, lots of casualties, doesn't want to be Jimmy Carter, also doesn't want to pull out of the war in the way that LBJ was forced to pull out of the war, but instead escalated, which then leads to 50,000 dead Americans. And who knows how many dead Vietnamese, but I've talked about that before. But I believe that he will leave a lasting impression on the world that Americans cannot be trusted. He can't keep his word. So Trump keeps saying that, oh, we're negotiating, or we signed an agreement, or they're begging me for an agreement, or even going to Versailles, of all places, to sign an MOU, or basically a surrender document. He doesn't even keep that, not even for 24 hours. But as I've been saying before, that the way racialization works, especially if you've never met someone of that demographic, or even if you did, the one that sticks out in your mind is the one that becomes the model to racialize everybody else. And so Donald Trump, because he's in the news and so hated or loved or whatever, because he is so dishonest. a lot of people in the world are going to racialize all Americans as Donald Trump. Whether you're a left-wing woke activist or a hard right conservative, it doesn't really matter. All of us will be collectively racialized as someone who is untrustworthy. Um, and this is not new. This is a phenomena that we see all the time. The way that people racialize all Iranians or all Israelis or all Palestinians, all Russians, all Ukrainians, et cetera, et cetera. And it happens all the time. There was a book I read in grad school, Domination and the Arts of Resistance, Hidden Transcripts by James Scott. The bit that I remember the most is that people who feel oppressed, they try to push back. And oppressed is a very broad term, right? But if, brother and sister can feel oppressed by each other. And so what you do is you push back in different ways. So if someone says, hurry up, you slow down, something like this. But one other strategy is to not tell the truth, right? You don't say just exactly what you feel. You hide a lot of details, which creates the impression that you are dishonest. And I remember that, my dad, when he first came to the United States, people warned him about certain ethnic groups. They said, oh, you can't trust them. And in Korea, there for a very long time, even now, I think they're trying very, very hard to erase this historical prejudice that's gone back at least 1,000 years. And they're trying to eradicate that as well. But I realized that generally the people who are oppressed are generally poorer than everyone else at that time. And so wealth obviously has a lot to do with it. Uh, it might be that the poverty is due to sort of unjust discrimination, but it's usually temporary. Like here in the United States, when the country was more free, people could move out of poverty much more easily and quickly than it is even imagined today. So there's that phenomena where, because of racialization, I believe that one of the legacies of Trump, and there will be many, will be that the impression is that Americans are liars. Now, this stands in contrast and in the face of attitudes of a lot of Europeans who came to the United States for the World Cup. And I've talked about that as well. And something that we should be aware of and what we should note is that a lot of the Europeans, they were like surprised because everyone told them that Americans are horrible people. Yeah, well, where did that racialization come from, if not from the news, if not from highlighted examples, people who stood out to Europeans? But what we should take away from this is that people are not the same as the government. Just because you live in a certain area and the politicians and the government is doing one thing, it does not necessarily, sometimes it does not necessarily reflect the attitudes and behaviors of the people who live there. Sometimes it's true, but usually it's not. I mean, if you look at the United States right now, the government, Trump administration, refuses to acknowledge the wishes of the majority of the people. And I'm not saying that they acknowledged or went along with everything Biden said either. But he's the president right now. And so that's the one that I'm just going to point to. But it's always the case, right? Every president, I think, in recent memory has promised to end wars. That's why they got elected. And as soon as they get into office, they turn around and they start wars, right? So this is something that is not new. It's just that right now it's the Trump administration. And that basically they refuse to acknowledge the wishes of the majority of the people. For example, the NDAA, where they merged Israeli and the U.S. intelligence and military and tech, which was already going on, but now they just formalized it. In other words, Israel always spies on the United States. Colonel Wilkerson was talking about Jonathan Pollock, I think his name, I don't know, where he was imprisoned for spying for Israel, and not only for Israel, but sold off a lot of secrets that eventually ended up in Russia, etc. I have mixed feelings about spying in general, however, the whole intellectual property thing, but I can see where a lot of people, and justifiably so, you don't merge your intelligence operations with a foreign entity. It's just so weird. But nevertheless, it happened. And in the process, what happened also is that the black budget of the United States, right, the secret budget that no one even knows where all the money goes, is now going to be shared with Israel as well. So I don't know how that benefits the United States. It clearly benefits Israel. And that is a marriage that is going to drag the United States down to the very bottom. But no one really seems to care about that. But here we are. And unfortunately, there are a lot of examples of by the Trump administration, perfidy being one of them, which basically will legitimize and validate this legacy. It's really unfortunate. It's very, very sad. And it upsets me greatly, simply also because of the things that I had to go through when I was younger. But came to love that free aspect, the freedom aspect, the ideal of freedom that used to be lauded and promoted here in the United States. It's just, I can't, it's very hard to find these days in leadership, in positions of leadership. Something Karen Wilkerson said also, I think someone asked him, like, where were you? And he says, I was at a friend's funeral. And someone said, what is usually said? Oh, I think it's Nima's podcast dialogue, I think is what it's called. And he asked, oh, so what goes on in these Western funerals? And so he said, well, one thing you hear a lot is that, and a lot of them, because they're ex-military, right? They would say things like they didn't think that they would live long enough to see the United States in such bad shape, right? In other words, in 1980, the height of the Reagan era, everything seems so great. Then you have the fall of the Soviet Union. Hey, things are great. And then now we have this, which is just absolutely insane. American empire, you know, involved in overthrowing governments of other sovereign governments of other countries, waging war everywhere, left and right, when we can't afford it and there's not even enough ammunition to sustain it. So, how did it get this way? Well, you could think that it's the arrogance of the West, which I've talked about before recently, hubris, pride, or maybe just being lulled into complacency. But this is just human nature. One might say, how did it get this way? We can point the finger, but I think it's human nature for us to get comfortable, to become conservative, which then opens the door to all kinds of corruption, complacency, not noticing the subtle changes that are actually symptoms of corruption. I think that's human nature. Even scripture talks about it, where it says, the devil prowls like a roaring lion, waiting for someone to devour, or sin is crouching at your door. So every opportunity to come off of a path of productivity to a destructive, self-destructive path, it's part of our DNA. This is why we can't have nice things for any length of time. It's just kind of pathetic. Contributing to this decline of the United States is this whole postmodernism thing. Now, I understand why postmodernism came about, but it should have been rejected, or it should have been properly understood. I've talked about it before, postmodernism, and literally it's the period of time which comes after modernism. And what's modernism? Modernism is where everything is categorized. Everything has a name, label, phylum, genus, class, species, everything has its place. And then postmodernism comes along and says, well, yeah, you have these categories, but they're messy. It doesn't really, there are a lot of things which don't fit, especially when you look at things in a subjective way. When you start considering things subjectively, introduce subjectivity as one of the factors, then everything becomes muddled. It's not as clear as the modernists thought. And so then they proceeded to take apart and dismantle everything that existed, not to start over, but to establish their own extremely narrow, self-righteous, hypocritical standard as the norm. That basically is what we're saying. And once you begin that path and the university embraced it, then what you begin to see is even more extreme examples and expressions of postmodernism. And that's where you get the whole woke agenda and all the things that can be considered woke. It's very extremely narrow subjectivity that is forced down your throat. Now, postmodernism, I believe, is meant to help people take a hard look at their own cultural values. Um, to say what really is something worth holding on to and what is something that is not worth holding on to, or what is my choice? What am I going to choose to do? And unfortunately, the a lot of the postmodernists and the wokes, they ignorant of anything outside of their own little narrow subjectivity. And so they ignore economic, uh, economic issues, economic considerations, or even the considerations of the sciences. And what was so ironic, perhaps, was the word where during the whole global lockdowns, science was co-opted by postmodernists, and so science ceased being science. It was just absolutely insane. But uh, so before the postmodernist era, people had to evaluate the true cost of their cultural values, especially coming from a largely monocultural situation to a multicultural situation. People had to sort of juggle and try to calculate which values they were going to hold on to and which they were going to let go of. But then the whole woke culture changed that calculation, and more people are then finding it easier to maintain their own culture, ignoring and flaunting local laws and regulations in favor of their own culture. In other words, it got a lot cheaper to break the law to maintain one's culture rather than to suffer from keeping one's culture because of the laws that are in society. That's what woke culture has done to us. It's changed that calculation, which is why you see more and more, and then the mass immigration on top of that, and the welfare is also another contributing factor. However, that is the big thing. What woke culture, the postmodernist era has done is that it's changed that calculation where people then take pride in horrible, horrible cultural values or abuses of cultural values instead of trying to reevaluate and try to figure out what might be a better way of living. And I speak from experience too, growing up in the United States. That's why I did my dissertation on race theory to try to understand why I had to go through the things that I had to go through. And of course, the conclusions I came up with were largely unpopular, widely unpopular with the people for whom I had written it. And that makes me a little bit sad, but now I'm doing this podcast thing and just and part of the reason why I'm not so bent out of shape is because I think that what I wrote about is so obvious, is like stating the obvious, but no one has the courage or even the willingness or the attitude of sacrifice to repeat it. In other words, if you adopt my approach to culture, race dynamics, it's very difficult to profit from it. There's no way to really profit from it. But if you maintain the status quo, the traditional understandings of race and culture, then you can make a lot of money. So I understand why people are unwilling to do that because there is no financial reward. There is a lot of psychological reward. There's a lot of family reward, but who cares about that when you can make a lot of money, right? But anyway, so people have forgotten taking a step back now. So people today have largely forgotten that the origin of most of our problems is the assumption that government can save us and solve all of our problems. But of course, you'll always see this radical element of society. Like I consider myself a radical intellectually, but then you have others who then take the next step and actually turn it into a business idea. And so apparently over in England, where they have, what do you call it, surveillance cameras everywhere, they came up with something called adversarial clothing. Clothing, which has a lot of patterns, repetitious patterns, which throw off a lot of the facial recognition software of some companies. But you could see how it could develop that it would be able to address most facial recognition programs and algorithms for now. But basically, whenever there is increased oppression, reduction of freedom, there's always people who are going to try to come up with and then profit from the other side, which is to push back against that authoritarianism, sort of the art of resistance in different ways, perhaps more productive ways. But it would be nice if people just figured out that government is the problem. Government gave the money, our tax money, to these companies to set up these surveillance cameras so that we have less freedom. Someone's got to recognize the pattern, this obvious, um, you know, uh, system of grift and graft and corruption, and to overturn everything. But until then, we have to look forward to all we have is looking forward to this legacy that Trump has given to us, which is that of dishonesty. Uh, I'm reminded of a dialogue that, and this is kind of corny, but there was a movie called The Outlaw Josey Wales, and it was released in 1976. It was a Clint Eastwood movie. I like it a lot. But basically, Josey Wales was an ex-Southern Confederate soldier, and it's after the Civil War. And what they do is they focus in a lot of the heinous betrayals acts of the federal government, the Northern Army. And so that's basically the background of the movie. But towards the end of the movie, there's this threat from, I believe they're Sioux Indians, and their leader at the time was Ten Bears, a guy named Ten Bears. And so basically, Ten Bears was coming after Josey Wales, his little settlement. And so Josey Wales goes out to meet them. And there's this really cool long dialogue, but focusing in on this one little bit. I'll read the script to you. It says Josey Wales, played by Clint Eastwood, says, "That's true. I ain't promising you nothing extra. I'm just giving you life, and you're giving me life. And I'm saying that men can live together without butchering one another." And Ten Bear says, "It's sad that governments are chiefed by the double tongues. There is iron in your words of death for all Comanche to see. So there is iron in your words of life. No signed paper can hold the iron. It must come from men. The words of Ten Bears carries the same iron of life and death. It is good that warriors such as we meet in the struggle of life or death. It shall be life." And I remember when I saw that, I thought, oh, that's so cool. That's the way it should be, right? That there are people who cannot be trusted, but individuals can trust each other, right? And that's basically what voluntary cooperation is all about. That's what freedom is all about. You don't rely on the government to make sure that the transaction you're about to make is good or bad. You don't need this. All you have to do is trust the person that you're dealing with, and they need to trust you. And in order for them to trust you, you have to be trustworthy, vice versa. Those used to be American values, I believe. That's what I fell in love with. That's what I like to embrace and try to believe in, even when there were examples of people who, did not follow this. But for some reason, they weren't strong enough. Like these values of integrity, of being trustworthy, uh, they weren't strong enough. they weren't valued enough to be able to be maintained in the face of all this postmodernism. Well, I believe that these values are not just American values. These are values that are achieved and fostered in an atmosphere and society of freedom. And so we need to get back there. We need to start remembering the value of freedom, and then enjoy the fruits of uh, that mindset of living with values that come out of and are developed as a result of freedom. And as I said before, that morality discovery will lead us into even better times, more better technology, free from all of the baggage and government backdoors and little algorithm viruses that inform on us to the government. We need to go back to that idea of freedom. That's it for today. Hope you have a great weekend. I'll talk to you guys next time.